All right, we're back in the Haskaps now. So what's going on here? What is all this color behind us?
Okay, well, we have photoselective netting that's covering our Haskap. This is a trial, and it's meant to look at various things. So one of them is the effect of the netting on the growth and yield and other factors in production of Haskap. But this started off, we were also looking at Saskatoons and sour cherries to see how well they responded, what the different physiological responses were to that. And so in those earlier trials we found that it appeared that the blue netting was the superior type of color.
Okay.
And each color has a different physiological response on plants. So
Okay.
in general, the red netting, for whatever reason, sort of bends the light spectrum as sunshine is coming through, and it promotes more elongation of plants. So you tend to get larger, leggy plants. For Haskap, that might be a good thing because they're sort of slow growing. So that might promote a little bit of earlier, high, vegetative growth. But in terms of yield, it wasn't the best. The blue outperformed it, and that was fairly consistent from the Saskatoons, the Haskap, and the sour cherries.
Okay.
The quality was seemingly a little bit better. It was just more uniform. And when you compared crops underneath the photoselective netting compared to outside of the photoselective netting, like here, there were also different things that was beneficial to having photoselective netting. So reduction in insect infestation under the net, and also reduction in disease spread. And I suspect that part of the reason is, when you get rain coming down, for example, in disease, it's sort of stopped and it pools on the net and then falls through. So that driving, penetrating, aspect of with wind and storms and stuff like that is reduced under the net. And then when you have rain that hits the surface of a plant, if there's a disease spore there, it spreads to the surrounding tissues wherever that splatter goes to. But under here, that was greatly reduced. So, for example, in the dwarf sour cherries that are over here, there's a disease called brown rot, and brown rot has two sort of spore cycles. It starts in the spring, and it will infect flowers and the flower stems, and it'll blight them. But then it sets up for a secondary infection later on in the season, and the spores will spread given sort of higher humidity conditions and about 26 degrees Celsius. Then the spores will spread from fruit to fruit, and it's mainly when they're starting to ripening up and they're a little more loose, and it usually goes in the areas where the sun isn't really shining on them, where they're a little bit moister. So for whatever reason, I suspect it's from rain splatter. There was relatively very little brown rot on the cherries that were covered in netting, and the ones that were outside of the net were pretty infected with brown rot. So it has that effect, so it's beneficial for disease control. And the insects, I suspect, in some cases, we didn't get yellow netting, but they say that yellow netting is sort of repulsive, the color when insects are flying by. Certain insects don't like that color and they'll stay away. And there's also a little bit of reflection, so those little bit of sparkle from the sunlight maybe throws them off, and they don't like to go inside as much. With the Haskap, they require pollination, and they require cross-pollination. So it's a bit of an issue. They flower very early in spring, so it's like early May that the flowers are already in bloom. And if you have cold conditions, Apis mellifera, the honeybee, won't be flying under 10 degrees Celsius. So then if they don't get pollinated, you don't get the yield that you hope for. This year was very hard on honeybees, so in some cases a lot of producers weren't getting very good yields because the honeybees weren't in there. Wild bees, like bumblebees, do a very good job of cross-pollinating, and we do have quite a number of bumblebees in this area, so we got a half-decent amount of pollination this year to get the production. So it is a factor, but if you cover the crop with this netting, it's less likely that the honeybees and other bees are going to get in there. So
Right.
it's something that you want to put on after, you know, most of the flowers have been pollinated.
Yeah.
Then you put the netting down.
You kind of
So
have to wait and
you have to
play-
stage it, right?
Yeah, keep watching it. So.
Yeah.
So when did
And
this
then-
go on then?
This was early June, I believe, was the timing, like
Okay.
when most of the flowering had finished. Then we got it up when we could. So yeah, that was it. It also serves another purpose with Haskap, which I think I mentioned earlier to you, which is a lot of birds love Haskap, and especially cedar waxwings, and they come through in large flocks. And so I had them here last year, and even though I had the netting on, they robbed everything that wasn't under net. And then when I raised the netting to do some of the harvesting, they actually would come in within a foot or so of where I was and got in there and started robbing. They're just so aggressive at eating this particular fruit type. And once I had finished my harvest, they just left immediately. So that's how focused they are on this crop. So I'll maybe lift this so that you can just see what Haskap looks like, because this is probably a new crop for most people. So there's some of the fruit. They're sort of an elongated fruit, and it has a double skin. So there are two flowers that require pollination, and they kind of fold in on each other, so it's double skinned. So this is very high in polyphenolics and antioxidants, so it's considered to be a superfruit. In Japan, it's considered to be the fountain of youth fruit. And so that's what they look like. They're a little bit elongated. Some of them are a little rounder, but a lot of them are this sort of shape. And they have a little bit of a waxy bloom to them. They're very tasty. So I think that's it for the photoselective netting thing, but I should maybe talk about, so blue had the highest fruit quality, and it did seem to have higher yields than the other two varieties. That's just based on 1 year's data though, so
Okay.
it's hard to say. Red had more elongation, plant elongation, and this white one on the other side here, it isn't really considered to be white. They call it pearl, and it is kind of the happy medium between the blue and the red. It seems to not cause as much plant elongation, but it doesn't stimulate as much fruit production, I would say, but it's roughly equivalent to the blue.
Okay.
Yeah, so like based on 1 year's data, my initial recommendation is to go with blue, but we'll see, pearl might end up being better over the longer term.
Okay.
So
is this is common for producers that are growing Haskaps then, or?
no, the commercial growers have been using netting, and
Okay.
mainly to prevent cedar waxwings from robbing
Okay.
their yield. But one thing that we noticed is that Haskap doesn't grow very quickly. So you can see here, there's some new growth on here, just that portion. That's actually pretty good growth for what's been here. This has been here for a number of years. So it's a little bit challenged, and part of it is it's got shallow rooting, and so limitations on water absorption and fertilizer absorption, and the way that the plant grows, it sends out some growth, initial growth, and then it sort of shuts down. And actually it's a good adaptation under dry conditions, I found out last year, because I have some Haskap on my own, and I stopped irrigating because we didn't have the right kind of irrigation water at my own farm, and it was developing sort of salt buildup. So I shut it off, and I thought that the plants maybe had died because they lost all their leaves and they looked like they were basically done. But this spring, when I looked at them, they have sent up new growth. So it's a bit of an adaptation that although they're shallow rooted, the roots are fairly drought hardy, and if you get subsequent rains, they respond and send up new growth. But the photoselective netting has a shading property to it, as well as different colors. And that shading, this one is, I think, 30% shading. And that shade reduces evapotranspiration loss, so your water needs are reduced. And there was some work that was done in Quebec, and our initial fertilization was happening in the spring, and we were just basically giving it a blanket application and then leaving it. But they recommended doing split applications, and actually right up until the time of the leaf drop. And we weren't doing that. We were doing that initial fertilization and then leaving it. But they tend, since they're shallow rooted, they need that more constant application of fertilizers, it appears. So this part of this trial is giving them more, fertilizer as the season progresses. So it was done sort of prior to flowering, and then after fruit set, and also I've done another application, and I'll do one before the leaves drop, and we'll look at it next year to see how well they grow. But this crop also was susceptible to iron chlorosis, like we mentioned before.
Yeah.
And so that was part of that earlier trial, looking at irons and how we could turn this crop around, because they were very yellow and they weren't growing very well. So with those micronutrient applications of iron, we saw a pretty good response initially, and now I've broadened that out, so I'm including zinc and other micronutrients to see if we could up the ante a little bit more.
Okay.
So, and it appears to be working, because they are growing much better. So that's what this trials.
Okay, we did have a question online.
Okay.
Where would somebody get this netting from?
Clayworks from Colorado was the place that I sourced it from.
Okay.
There's a company called Green Tech from California, and they're sort of a wholesaler more than a retail distributor. And so my initial inquiries about the netting was through Green Tech, and they referred me to Clayworks from, I think it's Denver, Colorado. And they were very good about getting the netting for me, but it is fairly popular, especially in areas like California, so we have trouble sourcing it. It's a relatively new technology. It came from Israel initially, where they have very dry conditions, and they wanted to reduce evapotranspiration, and they wanted to see if they could promote growth using this technology. So they did the initial work, and then other people saw that same application would work for them, and we're looking at the same thing here. So
cool.
Yeah.
All right.
But it's popular in California, so they had trouble getting it because they order in large volumes, and I was just doing a small order. So,
okay.
But it is a little bit expensive, and we haven't done the cost-benefit analysis yet, so that'll be something coming down the pipe.
Excellent. All right. Anything else with Haskap Production?
Well, just mentioning, basically, it is beneficial to get shading. It doesn't need to be photo-selective netting, so you could go 20 to 30% netting, and there are bird nets that you can get that are cheaper.
Okay.
And there are different sources. If people are interested, they could get in touch with me, and I could provide them a list of different bird net suppliers.
Okay.
And then they do need sort of consistent watering and pollination. So, and we recommend establishing wild bee populations if you can, because the honeybee, the Apis mellifera, they're not consistent enough in early spring when these are flowering to give consistent pollination. So there's some years, if it's cold, under 10 degrees, the European honeybee won't get in there and do what it needs to. What happens is, though, the bumblebees and mason bees and things like that will do a good consistent job, but there are few of them, relatively few. So if you plant multiple species of flowers, they have somewhere to increase their populations over time, and that'll help you. But the difference with European honeybees is you can bring in 1 million of them, and 1 million can outcompete one anytime. So under normal conditions where the temperature is above 10 degrees, then the honeybee does the best job.
Okay.
But when you're in cool spring conditions, the bumblebee is pretty much required.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Awesome.
And if people are interested in how to develop habitat and that sort of thing for bees, we have bee specialists and everything that can help guide them along the way.
Excellent.
Graham Parsons.
Nothing else on that? Oh, one question. Will flies pollinate?
There are different kinds of syrphid flies or soldier flies, I think they call them, and yes, they do some pollination. I don't know how effective they are in Haskap because it requires more than one type of Haskap. So you don't have just a male and a female plant or something like that. You need a different cultivar to cross.
Okay.
And so you need species that are flying around and going from flower to flower to get that perfect cross-pollination. And as I mentioned, these have two flowers that form one fruit. So you need both flowers to be pollinated to get a nice fruit out of it.
Okay.
Some crops like sour cherry, they don't need cross-pollination at all. So I'm forgetting what the initial question was.
Do flies pollinate?
Yeah, and so those flies, I've seen them in sour cherries, and they do a job. Like you can get about 25% increase in production, getting some pollination, but it doesn't need to be cross-pollination. So they maybe do the job in plants like that or in Saskatoons, but in Haskap, I think it's less likely that they would do a good job in pollination.
Okay.
And there's somebody, Danae Fryer, who did her master's at the University of Regina, did a big study on Haskap pollination. So if people are interested in that, they can source that information there.
Okay. Well, I think that's it for questions so far, but maybe we can talk about the dwarf sour cherries next and maybe answer some general fruit production. Yeah.
Sure.
So.
Are we going to do that?